Legumes such as long beans, peanuts, and southern peas are a mainstay in my garden throughout the warmer months, but finding beans to grow through winter has led me on a fascinating journey into the world of fava beans, also known as broad beans. So here's a look into these amazing plants, their cultivation, when to harvest, and why they're the best winter beans to grow in my Central Texas garden. I'm Scott from New Garden Road, always out here to inform, inspire, and elevate you. Encouraging biodiversity and restoring habitat is my mission, one garden at a time. Let's start with a few key details about why I think fava beans are so valuable in our gardens. Number one is they are nitrogen fixing legumes. What this means is they have the capacity to extract nitrogen from the atmosphere, and they can store it in nodules that develop on their roots. These nitrogen nodules will go on to feed the plant later in its development, but they are also there as a benefit to soil dwelling microbes. And when the season's over, you can simply cut the plants at the soil level and leave them in the ground. Now I think they have an earthy flavor somewhere in between peas and lima beans, and the texture, I find it similar to chickpeas or garbanzo beans. They're a popular food source in the Middle East, Mediterranean, China, and Ethiopia, among other countries. They're commonly used to make a delicious hummus with fresh parsley and lemon juice, and you can also take the whole beans and roast them similarly to peanuts. Most recently, I was inspired to try grilling fava beans, and I'm going to share a few of my insights later in the video when we talk about harvesting. And along with being a nutritious food crop for us humans, they're often used as food for livestock. For me, one of the essential reasons to grow fava beans every year is that they attract a wide array of biodiverse wildlife. And one of the main reasons is because fava beans are one of the few plants that are producing nectar late winter into early spring. So it's there for the taking, and they attract the good, the bad, the ugly. I mean, just about every insect you could imagine. You will find quite an array on these plants. That being said, if you look at this scenario from an agroecological pest management standpoint, now I know that's kind of a big term, but essentially what we're talking about is in our urban environments, we have a lack of beneficial predatory insects, but we have an excess of herbivorous chewing insects and aphids, things along that line, grasshoppers, beetles, and they are out there trying to squash our plans as gardeners. Really, they're just taking advantage because in our urban spaces, a lot of the native plants and habitats have been removed as a result of development. And what we have seen, and this has been documented in studies, is that these herbivorous insects have increased in their population, their size is increasing, and they're laying more eggs. So it's the perfect scenario for them to thrive. But what we can do as home gardeners, whether or not it's a small patio, a deck, or container garden, or a backyard garden like I have here, is we can establish biodiversity through intentional planting. We can do that through native plants, but also through some of these seasonal crops like fava beans. When it comes to the diversity of life that is drawn to these fava beans, I really have been blown away. I'm talking about butterflies, moths, many species of predatory insects such as assassin bugs, wasp, and last season I identified a honey wasp for the very first time. These are really cool, kind of difficult to capture in an image. Along with that, I do see stink bugs, leaf-footed bugs, and they do a little bit of damage to the pods, but all in all, I've got a balance here. You really want all those insects there in proximity to one another. This means you don't have to go in there, spray any kind of gross insecticide or anything like that. You don't have to do anything. You can be observant. You can physically remove some of the stink bugs. That can do a lot to control the population. In a way, the fava beans become a trap crop in that, because it's fairly easy to spot these insects on the beans as they're kind of high up. So they're soft targets. You go out there early in the morning with a bucket of soapy water and you throw them in there. Use some gloves, don't be afraid. You can do it. But literally, just about every time I come out to look at these plants, I'm seeing a new species of insect that I've never observed before. Different types of bees, all kinds of colors, insects that I can't identify. So that's why they're a must grow in my garden, and I definitely think you should give them a shot. Moving on to cultivation, growing fava beans is similar to growing peas or other beans, and they don't require a lot of soil preparation. You can simply plant those seeds directly in the garden at the right time of year, And if you give them some consistent moisture, they should be germinating in about 10 to 14 days. Now, you may be able to decrease the amount of time it takes for them to germinate by soaking the seeds overnight for at least 24 hours. Now, you don't have to do this. You can make sure your seed bed is evenly moist to begin with, plant those seeds, and then you need to stay on top of it regardless. A couple of times a day, I would give them a good soaking until they germinate. But if you want to soak them, that may give you a leg up. In areas with mild winters, such as Central Texas, fava beans can be planted in the fall for spring production. And in my garden, I start to see them in October through early November. But one thing that will differentiate them from growing other beans is how long it takes for them to mature. We're talking about 5 months. After being planted in the fall, they'll go on to flower and set pods as early as February. Although fava beans are regarded as being much more cold hardy than other beans, generally into the teens, I do think it's a good idea to protect them from freezing temperatures, especially when they're young. Before they really get established, in my Central Texas garden, we generally run 70s to 80s, even into December. But what can happen is we'll get Arctic fronts that come through, and we'll go from those temperatures into the 20s. Now, that's just too much for just about any plant, despite their cold hardiness, if they haven't had adequate time to get established and beef up a little bit. So I find it helpful to protect them. I'll make some low tunnel structures using some PVC conduit, and I'll cover that with a heavyweight row cover. This is a 2.5 ounce fabric. It will give them about 10 degrees of protection. So if the temperature overnight drops to 20 degrees, on average, you're looking at about 30 degrees underneath that row cover, which should be more than enough to protect the fava beans. By the early spring, they'll really start to take off, and they can grow to a height of 4 to 6 feet. It's a good idea to have some staking or some other system for support as they get taller. And I do think it's a good idea to enact this early in their development, because once they get to a certain size, it can just be more difficult to get in there. And the plants themselves are somewhat brittle, so you don't really want to handle them any more than you have to. But in doing this, if you get some strong winds or a thunderstorm that rolls through, you'll be much less likely to get some damage to your plants. We had a fairly significant hailstorm last week, and I did get a little bit of damage to my plants. And what that taught me is that a little bit goes a long way, but a little bit more can do even better, because although I had some sturdy stakes at the corners and in the middle of my planting, along with some cross bracing and some C-bite clips to secure things, I only had one level of that cross bracing. So had I gone up another level a little bit higher, I may have done better. Beans will set, and ideal production will occur when daytime temperatures are in the 60s. If the weather trends a bit warmer and you start to get into an extended period in the 70s, this may curb the production a little bit. In my Central Texas garden, the temperatures range from the 50s to the 80s, but I tend to have fair production. When it comes to harvesting, you've got a lot of room for experimentation and flexibility. You don't have to let the beans mature to full size. You can take some of those smaller beans, the immature ones. They're great for snacking on in the garden. I find that they have a slight bitterness to their flavor, but it's a unique flavor, and it's not something that puts me off. You can snack on these raw, or you can prepare them like snap beans or green beans. For mature beans, you want to look for pods that are about 5 to 6 inches in length, and they'll be nice and plump, really firm, and sometimes they start to get a little bit shiny. I don't know if that really indicates that they're perfectly ready, but it is something that I've observed, and to me, it kind of says, go for it. If you notice a bit of browning on the pods, this is going in the wrong direction. This can indicate that they're beginning to dry, or it could be the result of some insect damage. It's also interesting to note that the flowers and the beans will set from the bottom of the plant up. So you need to make sure you're observing into those plants. Once they start getting big, like I said, make sure you're not missing any of those pods. In my research, I came across some recommendations that said you should pinch the top of the plants to enhance production. This is not something that I've tried as I've been growing them, but it's something that you might consider experimenting with. Now, once the beans begin to form, that flower will turn black, and I noticed that they stick to the base of that bean. And if you're not observant, you might notice that it looks kind of funny. Is something going wrong with your plants? I highly recommend that you observe in the garden regularly. That will key you into what's natural, what's unnatural, whether or not disease or pest pressure is there. This is something that I observed, and at first I wasn't sure if it was okay, but now that I know what's going on, I see that it's not a problem. I know we like to harvest with our hands and just pull fruit off of plants in the garden. And you can do that with some of these young fava beans. They'll come off pretty easily. But once they start to get mature, the stems are pretty stout. So using a sharp, well-maintained set of pruners will ensure that you don't do any damage to the plant, and you'll go on to have continued production. Don't forget to let some of those pods dry on the plants, and then you'll have seeds that you can plant in the following season. I mentioned grilled fava beans earlier, and I want to share some of my experience because I saw some recipes online. I did a little bit of research. This is really basic, straightforward here. You just throw them on the grill essentially. But what I did was I intentionally harvested beans of different sizes. I wanted to see how it played out. This is what I like to do when I'm cooking things for the first time. So some of those beans were smaller and some of them were fully mature. And from there, I just rinsed them, I patted them dry, I tossed them in a little olive oil, sprinkled them with some Himalayan pink sea salt, and they were ready to put on the grill. I heated up my grill to a good medium heat. My grill is not super high quality, so I ended up turning it all the way down to low, and it was plenty hot. But I put the fava beans directly on the grates. I turned them every 2 or 3 minutes, gave them several turns. The smaller beans, pretty quickly I could tell that they were done, and I pulled those off. I let the larger ones continue to roast on there, and you could hear them steaming. So what's happening is, you know, when you harvest a fully mature fava bean, you take it out of the pod, and then it's got a skin around the bean. So one of the things that's challenging about them is if you want to use them to make a hummus or something like that, you've got to blanch the beans after you take them out of the shell. You've got to take the skins off, and then you got to cook them down and make your hummus. If you grill them, you can almost eat them similarly to edamame. All right, so you take them out of the shell and they come right out of that skin. Super delicious. You'll get some of the salt on your fingers. It's a great appetizer or a finger food. Now check out more awesome gardening videos on my channel. Like this video and follow New Garden Road for weekly content. You can grow your own food. Keep it organic.